Brett, I've made you co-host. Do you mind just letting people in case I can't see them coming?
No
Or
problem.
if thanks for that. All right, so I think we have really good numbers, so I might kick us off then. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricardo Inácio. I'm with the clinical informatics team here at the Australian Digital Health Agency. So first of all, thank you for joining us in this information session that will tell you about the work that we're planning on doing to introduce a profile for endpoint in AU Core R3. So from the team at the agency, I have Stuart who will take us through this content today, and he'll spend some time kind of framing the problem that we're trying to solve and the proposed way forward to get to that. But before we get started in today's proceedings, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea, and community, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who might be present with us here today. So as I said, today's purpose is to present on the work that we will be doing to introduce a profile for endpoint in AU Core R3, and now I'll hand over to Stuart who will take us through this presentation. Stuart, how do you prefer to take questions? If anyone's got any questions, you're happy for me to interrupt, or do you want to have people save their questions to the end of your presentation? So what's your preference?
We have a question and answer session at the end. I think that might be easier so that we can get through the bulk of the content and speak to the context, and then we can go through questions after, if that's okay.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Over to you then.
Thank you. Alrighty, hopefully that comes up for everyone. I have had some screen issues in the past, so if there is an issue, please yell out. I'm sure
we can see it. Yep.
Fantastic. So thanks for joining everyone today. I'm going to walk you through the agency's proposal for inclusion of national endpoint in the AU Core R3 release. So we're looking to establish consistent baseline for how systems advertise connection points in FHIR and support growing interoperability across the programs and the wider sector as well. So a quick refresher for anybody that hasn't come across endpoint in FHIR before, hasn't dealt with endpoint. It describes the technical details of how systems can connect to deliver or retrieve information in FHIR using secure URLs, secure message addresses, or even imaging retrieval points. I know we've got some DI guys in here today. So we can think of it in plain English as this is the FHIR base URL for this clinic. And send referrals specifically to this endpoint for this specialty. They make services discoverable and routable across the health ecosystem. So looking at where we are at the moment, we already have Health Connect is already aligning to these profiles. We've got AU Core already defining some of these profiles for the major entities, which are organizations, practitioners, locations, and so on. But what we're missing is the nationally aligned endpoint profile. So the Health Connect Provider ID IG already includes an endpoint profile for secure messaging, but it's not yet harmonized with AU Core. So we're looking to introduce an endpoint profile into AU Core R3, and we can bring national consistency for how we represent those endpoints. So our focus at the moment, historically, endpoint in Australia has been used for secure messaging delivery, but as we move into more FHIR-driven models, we're looking to expand that definition, but without losing backwards compatibility as well. So our focus is sort of twofold here. We want to maintain compatibility with the existing secure messaging delivery implementations, but also add support for FHIR-based connection types, looking at how modern systems are currently integrating today. So the proposal that we have at the moment is that we're proposing AU Core R3 includes a nationally aligned endpoint profile that supports both secure messaging and FHIR-based exchange. This will give us a unified baseline that agency specifications and community specifications can align to, and prove interoperability across a lot of those different endpoint profiles. At the moment, we're deliberately proposing a bare bones starting profile that will evolve over time as the sector matures and more use cases emerge and the adoption of endpoint itself grows, especially organically through our working groups and our sparked accelerators as well. So why do we need an endpoint profile in core? It's a national baseline to help us reduce the fragmentation, improve routing and discovery, and streamline how we develop IGs now and in the future, and also align us to international practice. So the US and the Netherlands have already got inclusions for endpoints. They're pretty well mature over there in the way that they use them. We can start to align and look at their best practice and implement that over here in Australia. Importantly, the foundation will also make it easier to evolve interoperability over time as programs and use cases emerge through community and through IG development. So a key design principle we're looking at here is compatibility. The proposed profile we're hoping will be fully backwards compatible with provider directory secure messaging, also include a lot of the endpoint variants that we already have within provider directory. And we can look at avoiding introducing breaking changes and the support of a profiles to profiles model for agency and community IGs. And importantly, we maintain a distinction between endpoint, which describes where to connect, and a capability statement, which describes what a system can or can't do. So for enablement, once this profile is in place, it enables a consistent national way for systems to advertise secure messaging, FHIR endpoints, and service routing information as well. This will help the implementers integrate more reliably and more quickly by not having to go through layers and layers of exposure to find what they're looking for, and also aligns us with those international patterns from earlier, but without losing our Australian-specific environments and requirements here. So it positions us strongly for future programs like smart referrals, shared care, healthcare network that we're already doing, and that already depend on clear endpoint discovery. So we did take this through to Zulip as well. We've gathered some feedback through a Zulip poll, or a set of Zulip polls, I should say. This has been really valuable for us in confirming support for introducing endpoint into AU core. It's also shaped our scope and highlighted the importance of keeping the initial profile and maintaining alignment with sector expectations. So those results are pretty consistent across the board when we look at those polls that we had for Zulip and for endpoint. So here are our continued Zulip poll results. We can sort of have a look back and forth on those, and they provide a pretty consistent shape and pretty consistent feedback for what we're proposing here with endpoint inclusion. So our next steps are pretty straightforward at the moment. This is a bare bones proposal. On the 2nd of April, we'll walk through the draft proposal with the AU core work group. Then on the 16th, we'll present the final proposal wording. Between now and then, we will, of course, keep continue refining the profile based on any input that community has. So this is our current sort of context and where we're at when it comes to our endpoint proposal, what the proposal is and where we're going to go with it. So we can open the floor now to discussions and questions from anybody. Happy to get right in the weeds with this. We do have a fair bit of time set aside for this. I am joined by my colleagues here from Clinical Informatics and Ryan Maben, our branch manager as well. So there's a pretty profound knowledge base in the room today.
Thanks, Stuart. Just one thing that I'll probably add is everybody who's responded to the poll. So we'll eventually tag you on Confluence when we make our proposal visible and when we have the draft published. So we'll try to direct comms at you specifically because you expressed interest in that poll. So just letting you know that. Yep.
Brett?
Oh, I was just going to say, could you give us links or otherwise to the international material that you have been looking at? That'd be interesting.
Absolutely, no problem.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and I dropped a comment just on the Confluence page not that long ago because I hadn't got around to it. But I'm kind of interested in how we can use our existing capability conformance specs like AU Core, for example, where we have some requirements laid out and some capability defined. And so how we could reference specific versions of capability and that kind of thing. Because I think that's probably a useful thing to be searching by.
Yeah, we've definitely captured that. So we've captured that already because you had expressed that requirement previously. So it's already in our list of
Nice.
things to look at. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Angus?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how you see we're talking about AU Core. So how do we see the relationship with AU Base and also the published AU Provider Directory Implementation Guide? Not the Provider Connect one, but the older AU Provider Directory. So we're talking about AU Core, but do we, as part of getting to AU Core, we're going to do an AU Base to get to AU Core? And just what does this mean for the older AU Provider Directory Implementation Guide that had an encounter, which also had an endpoint profile in it? So just want to understand the relationship between all of them.
I can have a go. I think AU Base is on the card, especially to make sure that we capture all the terminology requirements. So it's something we'll be looking at. In terms of the relationship to the old Agile 7 AU PD2, so we're actually talking about that just last week. Look, I think the agency is currently looking at potentially putting forward a project proposal to help refresh that specification and bring it to alignment with the latest version of AU Core. So I reckon that will be the first starting point, and if we can get that done successfully, then it means I guess we'll have alignment happen at the end of that piece of work. So we're currently looking at what we can do and when we can put forward that project proposal. And one of the first things we're going to do is to try with the new GOM is to, I guess, ask the question from the TSC on which work group would be the most appropriate to also help us look at this work. So we spoke about the FHIR work group. We've also spoken about AU Core work group in discussions with Brett last week, but I think it's still not 100% clear which one we need to leverage, but the intention is there, and we'll likely have more to say about this in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Brett did clarify as well in the chat for the HCAPD, the old AUPD. They're from base now and don't currently have an AU base endpoint profile. As Ricardo said, it is also something else that we're looking at for taking this through to base. But we can also let community decide where we end up and which work group we end up in first, if it's core, base, or both at the same time. Heath?
Can you just go back a slide or two? I've just got a question on one more, that one. Service-specific routing. Sorry. Go forward one.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Service-specific routing information. What are you thinking of there? What does that mean?
Let me pull up my speaking notes for a moment.
I think this has to do, Stuart, and you can check while I talk in case I say something that's not right. But I think this has to do with you being able to say, look, if you want to send me something that pertains to gynecology, you go here. But if it's something about physiotherapy, whatever, you go somewhere else. I think just having the ability to also break down the metadata at that level to differentiate where certain things should go to help direct the traffic. I think that was the idea that we spoke about.
Okay, and as another question is around, have you thought about smart apps and their endpoints? I haven't thought about it enough to know if it's a silly question, but I'm just putting it out there that it may be another.
It links to this because I think one of the authentication types that gets defined in endpoint is smart. So I haven't explored that probably in detail, but I've seen some linkages in there, especially when it comes to authentication, which I then kind of imagine can take you to launch context and things like that if you're already threading into that space. But I haven't looked more closely beyond that, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about the app, and as I said, it may either
Oh, gotcha.
visit the other direction. So, what is the launch URI? But again, I haven't quite worked through
Mm,
what that all might look like, but and what the overlap might be into like a marketplace kind of space as
yeah, okay.
well. But yeah, as I said, I'm just putting it out there. I haven't thought about it enough to.
Yeah, but it's probably an interesting concept in the sense that if you can specify an authentication type around smart, and if you can then call out the apps you might have for the different probably purposes, maybe you can also use this as a way to discover apps that are applicable to what you're trying to achieve, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it might be worth thinking about a bit more, but
Mm,
given that we haven't thought about it before, it may not be an immediate use case, but
yep. Brett?
I think that's a great idea. Because I can see a world because like you'd want to know locate an app that requires AU Core R2, right? So you want to know that the app is compatible with what you can supply in some ways as well. And the endpoint is the app launch. That's an interesting idea. I haven't thought of that one before. I just wanted to comment. I think there's and I think we've seen this with the SMD endpoint definition before. Like whenever you have, in some cases, with payloads and usage of that endpoint, you need to supply other public information. And that's kind of like what some of those extensions are doing to help you format V2 messages and public certificates and things like that. So I think for me, that's a more specific endpoint requirement kind of set of things that we have to cover. I mean, for SMD, it's quite complicated because there's a number of extensions to help you format sources and things for the V2 content. So it's actually V2 over SMD is actually the endpoint type. Um, so I think that's something to think about because I kind of go those those extra parameters we supply on endpoints for V2 are really to do with the V2 payload, not the actual service mechanism. So if I had, say, a raw V2 endpoint and like minimum low level protocol, those would still be practical. So I think that there's kind of this mixing of um, the China kind of channel and connection authorization requirements and the payload service requirements as well, and sometimes they overlap, and we need to kind of think about that as well as part of working through.
Yeah, happy to
so
answer that.
so my point's somewhat related to that, and it's those extensions that are SMD specific that are very much V2 orientated. Um, I can't, the term's not coming to my mind at the moment, but those endpoint identifiers, EDIs, that's it, the EDIs that are actually being carried in those extensions at the moment for existing SMD providers, I would be reluctant to include those as part of AU core profiles because I kind of think that they are almost in a deprecated state, perhaps. People might disagree with me, but um, yeah, I just not concerned about polluting an AU core profile. I see that as a PD2, PD3, or whatever it's going to be, slash the HCA profile requirement, not an AU core profile
Yeah, I think they're very
requirement.
specific. I think they're specific. They're specific profiles that you would, because like the one in ACA is an SMD, V2 over SMD profile for endpoint, exactly. And like I think for his point, like in core, we kind of don't want to, I think, define all the kinds of different endpoints that it can be. So I think, yeah, I think it would be good to think about where they should get defined, like whether they should be centralized in a PD spec or whether the specs that are closest to the content that in the payload should look after them or things like that. But that's a
Yeah,
different question.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. I think there's also the argument that you're already using it in a couple of different specs. So from that perspective, wouldn't it make also sense to have it in core? But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's probably we'll I think put some thinking into that and include that in the proposal when it gets profiled modeled. Yep. Any other questions or comments?
I have another one just on approaches. This, like, I think this is really hard to do in the generalized sense. So I think it'd be good to really think about, and I think, you're kind of down this path already, but like having a specific connection type that people are looking to find and use. I think it's much easier to kind of try and identify those key connection types that people want to have and will support because it's kind of like you can use this to say I can do anything at all, but that's pretty broad. So it's I think there's going to be some common patterns of use. The things that come to mind are like, yeah, maybe like SMD is one. An AU core responder that you can connect to and get information, a patient summary source, that you can access and get patient summaries. Right. So
I
these
see
are
how
all.
you're trying to get yours included into the.
Yeah. I think it's really the thing though that I was noticing too, like say at the moment in patient summary we have a producer actor which defines requirements, but that doesn't have a capability statement. So um, there's no interaction requirement defined in that spec. So I think when you want to define an endpoint to connect to, you need an interaction requirement, conformance that you can rely on. So you can say, I know this endpoint implements read and search or whatever. So at the moment, like the PS spec doesn't have that. It just says what the producer content payload will be. So I think, yeah, I think too, you can, like the other thought I had was like maybe there's a kind of definition where you can identify operations that are supported, and things like that. So that's in a much more in a FHIR sense, what you can expect. So a dollar doc ref or a dollar summary or something that you can expect on that endpoint, more specifically without it being in a spec. But these are all kinds of things where I think you've got a very specific set of interactions you can expect to be supported, because I think that's what you're going to be trying to find in discovery. Yeah.
The other is probably mixed up in FHIR API endpoints, but I'm just wanting to confirm that we're also thinking about subscriptions in this space as well. It's yet just another endpoint, I know, but yeah, just wanted to make sure it's covered in the use cases that we're thinking about.
Michael.
Yeah, I think I was just continuing on from Brett's about that, I suppose, service-specific routing, and that thought about the actors, given e-requesting as well, like you're an e-requesting server and the like. So you know what type of interactions you're going to have with that endpoint. And we've got a number now. Yeah, we've said patient summary, e-requesting, those sorts of things about how we model that, so that you kind of know what the intent of that endpoint is for.
Yeah, I think there's two different fields there. One of them is what are the transport capabilities here? Have you got REST? Have you got subscriptions? Have you got GraphQL? Have you got secure messaging? Is it a fax endpoint? So there's the transport set, and then there's the service feature set. Does it do summary or e-requesting respondent, or what services do you offer, not what transport do you offer?
Yeah, okay. Right.
Yeah, the thing I'm really keen on is to have proper versioned actor and capability described on these things so that you don't because we can happily go and list FHIR endpoints using a pretty simple definition of endpoint and just go there's FHIR, RESTful FHIR on the end of this and good luck. And then that means that you can't really know what the service can do until you go and connect to the endpoint and check the capability statement. So I think, yeah, that's not super useful, right? As a directory kind of entry. So I think, yeah, I think Swing really trying to frame up the expectation in terms of the services that you will have, and having common patterns and usage around those things is obviously a good thing because people have to implement them as well on those endpoints. So I think yeah, and I'm kind of looking at an open-ended kind of mechanism for that. So if when version 3 of AU Core comes out or whatever, we can actually know what the endpoint can do. Because and versioning is important, I think, as part of that as well, because you have different requirements in those things. Yeah, that's all.
I might play devil's advocate just a little bit on what you said there, Brett. If I've got a FHIR endpoint that I add an e-requesting provider service to, or I enable subscriptions, and it's a new feature, then other actors can come and ask my endpoint what it can do. But if we've got a registry somewhere else that I have to update, as well as my system, I've got to update the phone book in how many other places to advertise that I've got it. Do we open ourselves up to a lot of difficult overhead in having to know how many registries need to be updated that we've now got this new endpoint service and transport capability?
I think it's more that you don't, if you're in purely in discovery, like I don't know what you can do. You might have more than one FHIR server as well, operating at in your healthcare service or whatever. So like I kind of need that a level of hints that I know because I think a lot of the interactions will be locating a healthcare service or a organization that you want to connect to and then going to find the appropriate endpoint that you need to connect to do your business. I think that will be a common pattern. So to me, like if I can't identify which endpoint is for what, it's going to be. I mean, you can go and discover it. I think it's where does that discovery happen? Yeah, and so with the overhead also comes the discoverability question, and I think there's the question is where do you draw that line? Because you could do exactly what you said, which is just have the endpoints there that are they're FHIR endpoints, and you can go and find out what they can do. Yeah, but that's the choice, I think. So I think that's part of the granularity question on how we define them as well.
I think this is probably more provider directory than a core, but there's potentially a role there for conformance as well. So if there's been a conformance assessment and said you have a conformant endpoint as part of this ecosystem, whatever ecosystem it is, then it gets published in the directory, and that's kind of managed by the directory, right? As in whoever's managing the ecosystem. So that may be a way as yes, this is the list of sort of conformant endpoints that someone has done conformance on and then published and made available. So that's kind of your participation in the ecosystem, as in it's published in this authoritative source, the directory that then says in this ecosystem, these are the authoritative sources for those endpoints, rather than a discovery exercise going, well, anyone can publish an endpoint that looks like one of these, but this is the authoritative source of the ones that are conformant and accredited and the like.
Yeah. In the US, they've done something similar to that. So they have testing certification and they have the trust framework you belong to, which kind of leads you straight into that realm.
It forms part of the trust framework. Yeah.
Yep.
I just wanted to agree with Mark that I think going down to the route with too much capability statement stuff is dangerous. But I do like the idea of keeping it higher level, I think, which is what you were alluding to, Brett, with things like application roles. Sorry, the wrong term. Actors. Um, and so that might be a good way of like balancing between the two, like to be at least able to say I am a e-requesting placer. That starts to, and we know that you can then go and look at what is an referral placer, and then look at the capability statement for associated with that particular actor. I know it's not necessarily the capability statement of the service, but there's a couple of directions that you can go from there, but it really is highlighting the fact that this particular endpoint is my e-requesting endpoint versus this is my patient summary endpoint versus my AU core compliant FHIR API.
Yeah, they may all be the same endpoint too, right?
They could be,
But you publish them separately, so they can be different if you want them to be different.
or just have a list of actors that
Yeah.
endpoint supports. But yes. And keeping in mind, we've got the feature framework coming as well, though we can start applying features in this space
Yeah,
as well. But
true.
that's probably going a little bit too
Yes,
far at this point.
yeah, yeah. You triggered that for me too, Heath.
So a bit more than a bit too far, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's ready this week, Ricardo.
It's always good to have a
it's
bit of
ready.
a roadmap, of
Yeah,
things to
totally.
do next. So I don't think there's
Yeah,
any issue with that. And
yeah,
hopefully, as part of this discussion, I think we can also, identify a couple of things that we'll need to be tackling next. I guess.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
I th
yeah.
I I think it's like the benefit of the using the actors as the way to do it is because it brings in the expectations and the requirements of that producer, right? And you can know a lot about how to connect to it and what the payloads will be. And in fact, the payloads are probably defined what that by that actor definition anyway. So whilst we do state the payload types supported, um, you do have some definitions there about the requirements on that active producer. And it also opens up, you can do like, if you have another Fire IG that defines an actor with more specific capabilities or other capabilities, you can have a systematic way to refer to them, which is kind of helpful, if you have different internal zones of sharing and things like that. So, or, you can set up your own kind of ways of doing business. Because I think that will be like, because whilst we're talking about like national requirements and expectations, I think there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on. And being able to kind of put it into the same framework would be helpful.
And I think that versioning that you picked up on that one is key, that we don't forget that, because it will be an explicit way of saying, I'm talking about patient summary release 1 endpoint versus my patient summary release 2 endpoint, or and vice versa. So the canonical URLs of the actor would actually give us that for free without having to specify it as a separate data element, or however you want to be doing extension or whatever. So
Yeah, because I kind of didn't want us to go down the path of defining a whole bunch of specialized URLs for every purpose, and like because it's
mm,
kind of if we had a systematic way of doing it, that would be better. It's also too like I can see a world like AU Core is a big broad standard that's got a lot of things you can do. I can see subsets of that being practical, as well in terms of, I'm thinking like, you know, we're in provider directories. You could offer your own internal local provider directory using a specification, So I kind of think there's going to be a whole bunch of parts of specs that get used for different purposes. And, so I think these are all kind of just ideas, but if we had a systematic spec oriented way of defining those, it means there's less documentation to do because you have a spec already. Plus there's some expectation people are implementing those things. So you've got you've got a way to kind of control the patterns.
but we also need to support things that are not FHIR. So that's the other aspect. Not everything will be
Facts.
FHIR.
Yep.
Facts, like Mark suggested.
Yep. That's, I guess, also part of the proposed way forward. Is, you know, we're recognizing that there's more to look into, and yep, we'll eventually get to it. But yep. Any other questions? What? It's Michael.
Yep, I just did notice Ruben put in the chat about the smart app launch endpoints. I must admit I haven't had a close look at that, but noticing their concept of brands that they have in there as well. I think it would definitely be worth having a look at what they've done there and whether any of that's relatable to what we're doing. Is that something you've looked into?
We haven't. I think the only thing I picked up when Ruben pasted this on the chat is that they're using a small e on endpoint, so I wasn't too sure if they're referring to the resource endpoint or something else. But I guess there's just something to. Yeah.
They provide those profiles as part of the IG.
Yeah. Okay. So it's something we can look into.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested. I mean, I have looked at this one point, but I can't remember it now. Just the concept of brands and endpoints. I suppose that's coming back to the relationship of where the endpoint resource gets referenced, but where you may have different endpoints for different brands within your organization or different services within your organization. So just, yeah, it'd be interesting to have a look at this for any alignment or whether it's relevant or not to what we're trying to do.
Can certainly do that.
I've added that to my list for deep dive, and I've also included some of the references to the international ones in the chat as well, so you can go and have a play and see what we've been looking at on the site as well.
So what's the next steps, Ricardo and Stuart?
So, yeah, I think this is it. So I guess at this stage, this is what we're aiming for, and between now and the 2nd of April. So by the time we have the walkthrough of the draft proposal, we should have something available in the feature branch for people to go and have a look at. So that means some work will happen between now and the 2nd, but the 2nd is really the first time where we'll probably put forward a bit of a line in the sand of what we're planning on doing, and then just giving people the opportunity to tell us whether we're off track based on everything we've been gathering and hearing up to now, or whether we're on track. And I guess then from the 2nd to the 16th of April is when we're going to be looking at finalizing the technical work and putting it forward for a final voting at that meeting on the 16th.
So the first time we'll actually see it will be at the TDG, working group
at the
on
work.
The 2nd.
Yeah, we'll try to have a draft published before the 2nd. Look, that's it might not be too much in advance, but we'll try to have something published before that meeting. But the worst case scenario is we get to that meeting on the 2nd, and that's the first time we're showing what this is going to look like. If we need more time, then I guess we can always have a chat on the 2nd of April and potentially move the voting, give ourselves a little bit more of a buffer right now.
If anything does go public, could you post it out on? Are you cool?
Yeah. So we'll post it out and we'll update the Agile 7 Confluence page. So we'll I think the idea from now on is everything is just going to go in there. But it's probably a bit too ambitious. But if we all decide that we're not ready for the 16th when we get to the 2nd of April, then I think we can always move this forward by another meeting and bring it back for a final voting, which will give people enough time to share their feedback so we can incorporate it. But as I said, look, I think, we're still going to be putting forward a very kind of limited scope proposal at first. So we're not trying to solve all the problems all at once. And I guess that's going to be playing into whatever work we're going to be doing.
So just a matter of process. Obviously this is going to come to the TDG, Brett, and then I guess anything that is related to base will kind of be bubble up, if you like, or bubble across now to the FHIR working group. So, I mean, Ricardo and Stuart, are you expecting that you'll actually be suggesting value sets and extensions and the like, that would then need to be handled by base? Or do you think it's going to be less generic or less
Probably,
defined?
yeah, and clear at this stage, Heath. So I'm not too sure yet. Yep.
It would be good even because I know even the existing SMD value sets that are defined in the PD spec are not in a centralized terminology space. Like this might be a terminology work group question as well, whether you want to park them there in the shared space.
See
So
comment.
that's more of a C comment. Yep, there you go. Yeah, so I think there's some ones that are kind of hidden in the original PD spec and have been brought through into the HCA spec. So it'd be good to try to rationalize, where they should be. Since they probably need good visibility. And that could be
So
part of a base.
But that's
If
likely to be
everything's
another
there.
bubble, right? Another bubble to THO.
Yeah.
terminology work group.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think the question is what is that value set achieving?
Mm.
It might need changing too because it's actually specifically an SMD kind of thing. So it's so I think that's something we could sort out is because I think the terms are fine because they're just things we know, but it's about, I guess, are we going to create like a common set or a recognized set of these
Mm.
things, or what are we going to call it? And then that'd be a good target for base, I reckon, to be able to bind to that.
Yeah. I think it depends on how far we take this, I guess, initially. And, you might not need to. I guess we'll go away, probably rewatch this recording, just make sure that we get that scope well confirmed, and maybe there'll be something that will qualify for that. But if not, then I guess we'll know a little bit more very soon.
Ruben?
Yeah, I guess my initial position on that question is I think if we did have a value set like that, it should at a minimum include endpoints, or I should say connection types or payload types associated with HL7 Australia specifications. It's not going to be able to handle everything, and there will be a need for for values to come from elsewhere. So there's possibly an opportunity for some form of endpoint registry to be stood up. Whether that's HL7 or a different organization, we'd have to find out. But I don't think we can be as restrictive as to have a required binding to those value sets because the community will have lots of other endpoints to need to support.
And I think there's going to be a bit of like it's almost putting the placeholders from an AU core perspective. It's a matter of we need this value set. And here are some codes that we know about initially, and then have that bubble up. Oh, and here are some extensions that we think we need. Have that bubble up and bubble up again to THO. But as far as the AU core perspective is done, it's kind of like, okay, we've just got this placeholder. It's up to the other groups to be able to work out what other values that go in those value sets based on our requirements that we have now. And otherwise, we'll never be done. Like it's going to, The problem I'm worried about is seeing how long is it for AU Core to actually get this ratified, because there are so many other steps in the chain.
Yep. Andy?
Sorry, I joined the call late. I was just curious, when you say final proposal presented and submitted for voting, what do you mean by submitted for voting? What's the outcome you're expecting that vote to result in under AU Core?
Yeah, look, the idea was to do something similar to what we did with healthcare service, for example, when we developed the profile. I guess it's voting that we're happy with what's being proposed, which I imagine will then lead to the pull request being kind of accepted back into the main. Really, I think that's what we're asking for. That we're happy with what's being done, what's being modelled, and that we can.
I guess it's always going to be subject to a ballot
Yeah,
at some point.
of course.
It could get confusing if we start talking about voting on stuff around the place, because
it's committee decision, right, to add it as a draft or if they think it's FMM1 or not. So that's probably the only decision points. Like, if they're happy to include it as a draft, that's one level. And if they were happy to include it as FMM1, that's a higher level. You think it's done. But yeah, either way, it'll have to go through the regular motions.
Yeah, so
It's just it's the word final that's throwing Andy, I think.
Yeah, but the final draft.
That throws me too, because it's final draft. Yeah,
that's it.
Agreed on draft.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, any other questions? All right, I think we've all got a bit silent now. So, yeah, look, I think really good discussion. I think it's been kind of great to get this many people join the call and kind of flag the interest in this in this work. So I think now we'll go away, type up the notes, and try to bring back that first something you can see that will hopefully reflect a lot of the things we've discussed here, or if not, at least has a bit of a way forward to enable some of those things to be progressed in this next iteration or following iterations, really. So I guess from our end, I'd just like to thank everybody for taking the time. We'll update the HL7 Confluence page with this with these materials from today. We'll also open up maybe a separate thread in Zulip, so if anyone wants to reach out, you can do it through that channel, and and we'll come back in the next couple of weeks with something for you to have a look at and proceed from there. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. That was good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. See you later.